All right, in today's lesson, we're going to talk about simplifying radicals. And first off, let's just start with what is a radical expression. So you might not have ever heard this term radical. So a radical is this, what you probably know as a square root symbol. And the reason why it's not only the square root symbol is sometimes we can also consider cube roots or fourth roots or many different roots. But for all of what we're going to do just square roots. Okay, so we have a square root, and we also consider that a radical. But let's just consider an easier square root, probably one of the easiest ones. Let's go with 4. What does that mean? So what does the square root of 4 mean? Well, what it means is some number multiplied by itself is equal to 4. Okay, 4 is another, there's a special term for 4 you might see called the radicand. So the radicand is what it equals multiplied by itself 2 times. In this case, 2 times because it's a square root. The index, this is also called the index. These terms really aren't that important, but you just might see them. But the index is whatever root you're taking. So in this case, it's the square root of 4. That means it's what multiplied by itself twice, like 2 times, equals 4. Okay, so what we're going to do here today is we're going to simplify these radicals. And you're going to also see a term that says radical form. What does radical form mean? Well, radical form means that your answer or the way you write whatever number you're trying to express is written as a radical, not as a decimal. So I know some of these you can get decimal answers because, well, like the square root of 4, we didn't even answer this one. What is the square root of 4? 2. 2 times 2 is 4. So the square root of 4 works out to be equal to 2. But if it was the square root of 5, that wouldn't be a perfect root. It wouldn't be like 2. It'd be like 2 point something. But if you left it in radical form, you just leave it as a root 5. You would not write it as a decimal. Okay, a couple other things here. There is a property that we know that allows us to essentially factor radicals. So let's just consider root AB, square root AB, might also say that as root AB, is equal to root A times root B, which essentially means you can factor these things. So if I take like root 8, which that's not a perfect square. Root 8 well, if you look, that's why I have this multiplication table. All the perfect squares are listed on the diagonal of the multiplication table, which are the product of some number times itself. So like 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 4 is 16. Right? So on the diagonal, those are all perfect squares. Those are important numbers. So root 8 is not a perfect square, but I can simplify it and leave it in what's called simplest radical form. So root 8 is the product of root 4 times root 2. And so by having the ability to factor that and break it up into 2 factors of that root, I can simplify part of the root. Part of the root that I can simplify is the root 4 part because root 4 is a perfect square. So the square root of 4 becomes 2, and I can't do anything left with the other remaining radical part, root 2. So this right here, 2 times the square root of 2, is in simplest radical form. And we also might say that as 2 root 2. Okay, so another little thing about that. If I go over to the calculator, let's see. And I type in the square root of 8, I get 2.8284, blah, blah, blah. Okay, if I type in 2 square root 2, I get the same exact number because those two are equivalent. So what simplest radical form would mean is writing the square root of 8 as 2 root 2, not as a decimal 2.8284 or whatever. Okay, so I'm going to do the left column of these for you and give you some examples. Square root of 144. Let's simplify and leave answers in radical form. Okay, well, I'm going to first check to see if that number happens to be a perfect square. So 144, lo and behold, is a perfect square. So I look at where that perfect square comes from, and it comes from 12 times 12. So that one was a perfect square, which means I don't have to leave it as a radical at all. It's just 12. 150, however, is not a perfect square. So I can go back and look at my chart if I don't have these memorized. And so I look at, okay, 150, let's see here. That is going to be in between 144 and 169. So let's just start checking off the list going backwards. 144 is not a factor of 150. It doesn't divide by 150, does not divide by 144, nor 121, doesn't divide by 100 or 81, doesn't divide by 64 either, not 49. Not sure, 36, maybe a weird one, but if I take the calculator, you'll see it doesn't divide evenly, but 25 does. Good, so 150 has a factor of 25. So you can use your calculator to figure out that 150 divided by 25 is equal to 6. So 25 times 6 equals 150. So now what that allowed me to do would be to factor it into part of which is a perfect square. So now I can take that perfect square part, make it into a 5, and the root 6 part I can't do anything more with. So I'm just left with, in simplest radical form, 5 root 6. And I know that I'm done when the radical part, the root 6 part, doesn't have any other factors that are perfect squares. So if I think about what are factors of 6, well, 6 and 1 or 3 and 2. And none of those are perfect squares, so you know that you can stop there. Okay, couple more. 54, what is that? That's not a perfect square, I don't think, is it? Let's see here, get rid of my old stuff. 54, nope, that's not a perfect square. Does it divide by 49? No. 36, no. 25, no. 16, maybe, no. 9, yep, it's 9 times 7, or 9 times 6, excuse me. So 9 times 6 is 54, so I can break that up into root 9 times root 6, which root 9, that's a perfect square, is the same as 3 root 6. And we know from before that root 6 is not a perfect square. Okay, square root 18, that's the same thing. Look, it's got a 9 in it. Root 9 root 2, which is 3 root 2. Simplest radical form. And the last one's a little different. The last one has a 2 out in front already. So what do we do about that? Well, that just means multiply. So that's just 2 times whatever we break 32 into. I'm going to break it into 16 and 2 because that is the biggest perfect square that goes into it. So that will take me to my answer right away. Square root of 16 is 4, so that's 2 times 4, right? Square root of 16 is the same as 4 times square root of 2. So what I end up doing with that 2 on front is I just end up multiplying it by all the other stuff. So it's 2 times 4, which is 8. That's my number in front part. And the root part that I can't do anything more with is just root 2. 8 root 2 is in simplest radical form. Okay, so that's a little bit on radicals and simplifying radicals. If you have any questions, let me know.